Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dr. Michael Greger, coming to you live from my treadmill. I've been diligently working on my next book, How Not to Age. Tons of research out there. Actually, about 3 months behind schedule at this point, but fingers crossed, I should be able to get it out by December 2022, which means I should be able to resume my speaking tour and come to your hometown sometime in 2023. Before hunkering down to write the book, however, I've been scripting more than an entire year's worth of videos for NutritionFacts.org, so I can truly immerse myself in the longevity research for the new book. And it is out of this large batch of cued videos that I pulled out the videos for this webinar. Should we be concerned about mycotoxins in our diet? Not mycotoxins, mycotoxins. All the sneak preview videos I'm going to show are going to be up on NutritionFacts.org over the next few months, but you're going to be able to see them all right here, right now. Thank you for joining me. First, some housekeeping logistics, though. If at any time you run into technical difficulties, there are live chat Zoom staff standing by. Let me paste that link over into the chat box. Oh, are you seeing a black screen? I see some videos. I see some comments that there's no video. Is that the case? Let me talk to my staff here. Everybody see video? Somebody, Trisha sees video. Some people just see a black screen. Okay, I guess more people see me than they don't see me. Wow, it's like 1 in 10 say black screen. I don't know if you can see all the black screen, only black screen. I see you. That is strange. Do we have any advice for anyone who has a black screen right now? Weird. Well, hey, sounds like something to contact the Zoom live staff about. That's what I just said. If you're unable, if they're unable to help, then we also have NutritionFacts.org staff standing by too. Though I don't know if the Zoom people don't know how to fix it. I don't know what we're going to be able to do, but I always want to give you as many options as possible. Here, I'm going to paste that into the chat box too, how you can get a hold of our staff. Hopefully, you should be able to watch this video. All right. If anyone has any ideas, let me know. Let me see if there's anything. I don't know what else people can do aside from logging out and logging back in, ? Or changing the view in the top right. I don't know. But for the majority that can see me, let me see if there's anything else. For the majority who can't see me, let's move right along. If you can't, if you're seeing a black screen right now and you're all bummed out, don't worry, we are going to be sending you and everybody who registered for the webinar a copy, a full recording of the thing, so you actually be able to see it, and all the videos high def, so you won't actually miss out. But sorry if you're not seeing it right now. Please reserve the Q&A button in the Zoom window for content questions. Today's webinar is only an hour long, and reserve some time for Q&A at the end. Feel free to add questions anytime to the Q&A, though I may very well cover your question later on. The Nutrition Facts team will be compiling them, and hopefully we'll get to it at the end. And again, you don't have to worry about taking notes or anything. After the webinar, I'm going to send you full recording and a free link to download all the videos in high definition so you can see them in all their high res glory. So for those of you who can actually see me right now, let's move on to the first video, which is entitled Ochratoxin in Breakfast Cereals. Ooh, all right, let's do it. Okay.
Such as aflatoxin and
Oh,
ochratoxin, have been
sorry, in the
popping
middle.
up
Hold on.
in
Let's go back to the
France.
beginning.
Exposure to dietary contaminants was compared between vegetarians and meat eaters, and the results showed that exposures to persistent organic pollutants like PCBs and dioxins was dramatically lower among those eating more plant-based due to the non-consumption of foods of animal origins, though they did have higher estimated exposure to some mycotoxins, fungal toxins present in moldy food. Now, there are lots of types of mold on the planet, and the vast majority are harmless. But over the last several years, certain mold toxins, such as aflatoxin and ochratoxin, have been popping up in breakfast cereals. Hundreds of samples were taken off store shelves, and about half were contaminated with ochratoxin, for example. But those were store shelves in Pakistan, and Pakistan has a subtropical climate with monsoons and flash floods, leading to fungal propagation. But then, similar results have popped up in Europe, Serbia, Spain, Portugal. Then, mycotoxins were discovered in breakfast cereals in Canada. What about breakfast cereals in the United States? 144 samples were collected, and similar to other countries, about half were found to contain ochratoxin, but only about 7% exceeded the maximum limit established by the European Commission. What is the significance of the finding of ochratoxin in breakfast cereals from the United States? This was the largest study to date, including nearly 500 samples of cereal off store shelves across the U.S. Overall detection rates were about 40%, and although only 16 violated the European standards, all of the cereals with ochratoxin were oat-based, making about 1 in 13 of the oat-based breakfast cereal samples tested being contaminated. Ochratoxin has become increasingly regulated by many countries to minimize chronic exposure. Here are the current regulations for mycotoxins in cereal-based baby foods worldwide, for example. Some countries are very strict, like in the European Union. Other countries, less so, and one country in particular has no standards at all. Ochratoxin is not currently regulated at all in the United States. What if you stick to organic products? One might expect them to actually be worse, owing to the fact that fungicides are not allowed in organic production. However, mycotoxin concentrations are usually similar or even reduced in organic compared to conventional products. For example, in one of the breakfast cereal studies, researchers found similar contamination, and the same was found for infant foods. It cannot be concluded that one is better than the other from a mycotoxin perspective. Despite no use of fungicides, organic systems appear generally able to maintain mycotoxin contamination at low levels. But how much is that saying, given how widespread it is? How concerned should we be about the public health effects from long-term exposure of this potent mycotoxin? I mean, if you look at blood samples taken from populations going back decades, sometimes 100% of people turned up positive for ochratoxins circulating in their bloodstream. In some sense, they are unavoidable contaminants of food, since the detection of mycotoxins is not only easy, and they can remain hidden. And once foods have become contaminated, mycotoxins aren't destroyed by cooking, so are there some foods we should simply try to avoid due to higher risk of contamination? That's exactly the question I'm going to address next.
It is so easy to get smug about plant-based eating and food contaminants, right? Whether we're talking about toxic heavy metals or industrial pollutants like dioxins and PCBs, the banned pesticides like DDT. If you look at breast milk or blood levels in vegetarians and vegans, they tend to have lower levels of these toxins that tend to accumulate up the food chain. So by eating at the bottom rung of the food chain, plants, you can minimize your exposure. But then here comes along a class of food contaminants where those who eat more plants tend to be more exposed. But not all plants, some in particular, which brings us to our next video, ochratoxin in certain herbs, spices, and wine. Okay.
Oats can be thought of as uniquely nutritious, and one route they improve human health is by providing prebiotics that increase the growth of beneficial gut microbiota. Of course, there are oats, and then there are oats, ranging from steel-cut oats to, even better, intact oat groats, their form before being cut, all the way down to highly processed cereals such as Honey Nut Cheerios. Rolling crushes the grain, which may disrupt cell walls and damage starch granules, making them more available for digestion, which is bad since we want the starch to make it all the way down to our colon to feed our good gut bacteria, and grinding into oat flour to make breakfast cereals is even worse. If you compare the blood sugar and insulin responses, you can see significantly lower spikes with the more intact steel-cut oats. OK, but what about ochratoxin, the leading source of dietary exposure of this mold contaminant? But they aren't the only source. There's a worldwide contamination of food crops with mycotoxins, with some experts throwing around estimates as high as 25% of the world's crops. That statistic is attributed to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, but it turns out that stat is bogus. It's not 25%. Instead, it may be more like 60 to 80%. The high occurrence is likely explained by a combination of the improved sensitivity of testing methods as well as the impact of climate change. Spices have been found to have some of the highest concentrations of mycotoxins, but because they're ingested in such small quantities, they aren't considered to be a significant source. We can certainly do our part to minimize risk, though. It is also the consumer's responsibility to keep spices dry after opening sealed containers or packages. What about dried herbs? Mycotoxins in plant-based dietary supplements. The highest mycotoxin concentrations were found in milk thistle-based supplements. It turns out wet and humid weather is needed during milk thistle harvest, which evidently is why they end up being so moldy. Considering the fact that milk thistle preparations are mainly used by people who suffer from liver disease, such high intake of compounds toxic to the liver may present some concern. Wine, sourced from the United States, also appears to have particularly high levels. In fact, the single highest level found to date around the world is in American wine. But there's contamination in wine in general. In fact, some suggest that's why we see such consistent levels in people's blood, perhaps because lots of people are regular wine drinkers. Ochratoxin is said to be a kidney toxin with immunosuppressive, birth defect-causing, and carcinogenic properties. So what about ochratoxin decontamination, removing the toxin in wine? Now, ideally, we'd try to prevent the contamination in the first place, but since this isn't always practical, there's increased focus on finding effective methods of detoxification of mycotoxins already present in foods, and that's where yeast comes in as a promising solution, because the mycotoxins bind to the yeast cell wall. The thought is that you could strain out the yeast, but another approach would be to eat something like nutritional yeast to prevent the absorption. It works in chickens. Give yeast along with aflatoxin, another mycotoxin, and you diminish the severity of the resulting disease. But using something like nutritional yeast as a binder depends on the stability of the yeast mycotoxin bond throughout the digestive tract. We know yeast can remove ochratoxin in foods, but we didn't have a clue if it would work in the gut until 2016. Yeast was found to bind up to 44% of the ochratoxin, but in actuality it was probably closer to only about a third, since some of the bindings weren't stable. So if you're trying to stay under the maximum daily intake, and you drink a single glass of wine, even if your bar snack is popcorn seasoned with nutritional yeast, you'd still probably exceed the tolerable intake. But what does that mean? How bad is this stuff? We'll find out next.
OK, so should we be going out of our way to avoid foods and supplements that are more likely to be contaminated? Like, should we avoid oat-based breakfast cereals? Well, of course, like anything, that depends on risks versus benefits, which raises the question, how risky is this ochratoxin stuff, right? When I said ochratoxin is said to be a kidney toxin with immunosuppressive, birth defect causing, and carcinogenic properties, that was talking about lab animals. What about in people? Let's find out in my next video. Should we be concerned about the effects of ochratoxin? Let's find out.
Ochratoxin has been described as toxic to the immune system, developing fetus, kidneys, and nervous system, as well as being carcinogenic. But that's in animal studies. Ochratoxin causes kidney toxicity in certain animal species, but there's little documented evidence of adverse effects in humans. That's why it's only considered a possible human carcinogen. Big Ag assures that current ochratoxin levels are safe, even among those who eat a lot of contaminated foods. The worst-case scenario may be young children eating a lot of oat-based cereals, but even then, their lifetime cancer risk is considered negligible, with those arguing against regulatory standards suggesting you can eat more than 42 cups of oatmeal a day and not worry about it. Where do they get these kinds of estimates? They determined the so-called benchmark dose in animals, the dose of the toxin that gives a 10% increase in pathology, and then because you want to err on the side of caution, you divide that dose by 500 as a kind of safety fudge factor to develop the tolerable daily intake. For cancer risk, you can find the tumor dose, the dose that increases tumor incidence in lab animals by 5%, and extrapolate down to the negligible cancer risk intake, effectively incorporating a 5,000-fold safety factor. Seems kind of arbitrary, right? But what else are you going to do? I mean, you can't just intentionally feed people the stuff and see what happens, though, hey, look, people eat it all the time. Can't we just follow people and their diets out over time and see if people who eat more whole grains like oats, for example, are more likely to have cancer or live shorter lives? What is the association between whole grain intake and all-cause, cardiovascular, and cancer mortality? Every additional ounce of whole grains a day is associated not only with a lower risk for cancer, but also a lower risk of dying from all causes put together. Here are all the big cancer studies. Every single one, if anything, trended towards lower cancer risk. Bottom line is that you don't find adverse effects confirmed in these population studies. This is not to say ochratoxin is necessarily harmless, but any such risk it does pose doesn't outweigh the known benefits of whole grain consumption. And in fact, healthy constituents of the whole grains themselves, like the antioxidants, may directly reduce the impacts of mycotoxins by protecting cells from damage, so eating lots of fruits and vegetables may also help. Either way, a healthy diet can play a significant role in mitigating the risk. In summary, healthy foods like whole grains are good, but not as good as they could be because of ochratoxin, whereas less healthful foods like wine and pork are worse because of the mycotoxin. Ochratoxin was detected, for example, in 44% of tested pork.
Isn't that crazy how they come up with the tolerable, safe, daily doses? Just like, using those arbitrary fudge factor safety buffers. But again, what are you going to do? Well, we can certainly take solace in the population studies, though. Those eating more whole grains live longer, have less cancer. So whatever effect ochratoxin may be having, the benefits of whole grain consumption appear to outweigh any risk. Though the same cannot be said of, for example, wine and pork, right? Now, for those of you who think, wait a second, I thought a little, red wine consumption was good for you, check out my latest series of videos on how the balance of evidence has shifted to the less alcohol, the better, as opposed to the purported benefits of light and moderate drinking. And speaking of toxins you want to actively avoid, like alcohol, the final video I'm going to play today is on a different mycotoxin called aflatoxin. Unlike ochratoxin, aflatoxin is not just a possible human carcinogen, but a known human carcinogen. The title of the final video is Should We Be Concerned About Aflatoxin? Let's find out with an intro addressing the so-called toxic mold syndrome.
In recent years, mold has been blamed for all sorts of vague subjective symptoms, but we have little scientific evidence that mold has anything to do with them. However, this concept of toxic mold syndrome has permeated the public consciousness, perpetuated by disreputable predatory practices by those making money testing homes for mold spores or testing people's urine or blood. But all these tests are said to just further propagate misinformation and inflict unnecessary and often exorbitant costs on patients desperate for a diagnosis. The continued belief in this myth is perpetuated by those charlatans who believe that measles vaccines cause autism, that homeopathy works, and that fluoride in the water should be removed. Mold toxin contamination of food, however, has emerged as a legitimate issue of serious concern, perhaps even more important than other contaminants that might make their way into the food supply. Hundreds of different types have been identified, but only one has been classified as a known human carcinogen, and that's aflatoxin. The ochratoxin I talked about before is a possible human carcinogen, but we know aflatoxin causes cancer in human beings. In fact, aflatoxins are amongst the most powerful carcinogens we know about. For example, it's been estimated that about a fifth of all liver cancer cases may be attributable to aflatoxins. And since liver cancer is the third leading cause of cancer deaths worldwide and kills so rapidly after diagnosis, the contribution of aflatoxins to this deadly cancer is quite significant. And once it makes it into food, there's almost nothing you can do to remove it. Cooking, for example, doesn't help. So once it makes it into crops, or the meat, dairy, and eggs from animals consuming those crops, it's too late. So we have to prevent contamination in the first place, and that's what we've been doing for decades in this country. Because of government regulations, companies are almost always sampling for aflatoxin, resulting in nearly $1 billion in losses every year, which may get worse if climate change worsens aflatoxin contamination in the Midwest Corn Belt. So on a consumer level, it's really more of a public health problem in the less industrialized world, such as African countries, where conditions are ripe and farmers can't afford to throw away $1 billion worth of crops. Indeed, aflatoxin remains a public health threat in Africa, rural China, and Southeast Asia, affecting more than half of humanity, which explains why the prevalence of liver cancer in those areas may be 30 times higher, but it is not a major problem in the US or Europe. For example, only about 1% of Americans have detectable levels of aflatoxins in their bloodstream. Why even 1%, though? Well, the FDA works to ensure that the levels of exposure to these toxins are not kept as low as possible, but instead as low as practical. For example, in California, there's been an increase in unacceptable aflatoxin levels in pistachios, almonds, and figs. Unacceptable in Europe, that is, so it affects our ability to export, but not necessarily unacceptable for U.S. consumers, as we allow twice as much aflatoxin contamination. Figs are unique since they're allowed to dry on the tree. This makes them particularly susceptible to aflatoxin production. It would be interesting to know about the fig-consuming habits of the 1% of Americans who turned up positive for the toxin. If figs were to blame, I'd encourage people to diversify their dried fruit consumption, but nuts are so good for us that we'd really want to keep them in our diets. The cardiovascular health benefits outweigh the carcinogenic effects, preventing thousands of strokes and heart attacks for every one case of liver cancer. Thus, the population health benefits provided by increased nut consumption clearly outweigh the risks associated with the increased aflatoxin exposure. So we're left with aflatoxin being mostly a problem in the developing world, and because of that, it remains a largely and rather shamefully ignored global health issue. Where attention has been paid, it's been largely driven by the need to meet stringent import regulations in the richer nations of the world, rather than protect the billions of people exposed on a daily basis.
Wow, lots to digest there. Again, very little scientific evidence in support of any kind of toxic mold syndrome. Reminds me of that electromagnetic hypersensitivity reaction, or supposed reaction. I have a video about that showing the people who think they're sensitive to things like cell phones actually fail to distinguish between cell phones and fake phones when actually put to the test. Now, they may be suffering symptoms or something, but it's probably not electromagnetic waves, or probably not mold in this case. Okay, but aflatoxin is no joke. A fifth of all liver cancer. That's actually what Professor T. Colin Campbell was using in his pivotal experimental work, showing that rodents exposed to aflatoxin had more or less cancer depending on how much animal protein they were fed. But anyway, we test for aflatoxin in this country, so you don't have to worry about aflatoxin in peanut butter, or at least domestically sold peanut butter. I'm eagerly awaiting dietary survey data on what separates that 1% of Americans that actually come up positive for aflatoxin in their blood compared to everybody else. But until we have that, there's really not much guidance one can give. All right. Time for questions. Let me just give the staff 5 minutes to compile all the most commonly asked questions. But we should have a ton. So look, we're half the webinar will be questions. So from like 11:30 to noon, or at least in West Coast time, where I am in Seattle right now. So, let me put the 5-minute timer on. We'll compile a list of questions and then get on and do questions for the rest of the time. All right, let's get to your questions. Got a whole long list. And if we run out of mycotoxin questions, you're welcome to ask any questions. I do have a live Q&A next week, next Thursday, on both YouTube and Facebook. But might as well catch me while you can here. First question, are the spots on produce such as potatoes, bananas, cauliflower, oranges indicative of mold? And if so, do they contain mycotoxins? Should they be avoided? Is it safe to cut off generous spoiled spots and eat them? I presume you may even cut away the spots, not eat the spots. Okay. Spots on, like the spots on cauliflower, those brown spots, that's not actually mold, that's just oxidation, though it is showing that they're starting to open up to decay. Once the plant's defenses get damaged, then indeed you can get a bacterial or mold invasion. The spot, I mean, usually mold is kind of fuzzy. And so I don't think of like bananas, potatoes, or well, oranges certainly get moldy, but it's not like a little, you know, you see the little moldy spot. And the question is like, can you just cut off the mold? Like, do you have to, like, if you have a strawberry and there's a little spot of mold on the tip, can you just cut off the tip, eat the rest of the strawberry? And the answer is no when it comes to basic to soft foods like bread, or strawberry, something like that, you know, peaches. So if you have like a little spot of mold on your bread, you should not eat the whole bread, because that's just a little tip of the iceberg, and the little hypha, the roots of the mold actually go deep and can contaminate the rest, even though you don't actually see the mold on the surface. However, that's not the case for hard vegetables. So if you have like a spot of mold on a carrot or on a winter squash or something, you can cut like an inch around that spot, throw it away, and the rest should be good. Just because the little roots of the mold can't penetrate as easily through the dense, through something really hard like that. Okay, next question is, our home test indicates the presence of mycotoxins. Oh boy, are there lots of quacky tests from people that want to sell you quacky supplements, but that's basically this whole toxic mold thing, which doesn't appear to exist, other than the minds of people that want to exploit vulnerable people for money. Do fermented foods such as tempeh contain mycotoxins? Likewise, do sprouted foods contain mycotoxins? If they do, should we avoid them? So tempeh, what holds those soybeans together is this fungal mass, a special type of fungus, but that fungus does not produce mycotoxins. And so there are no mycotoxins in tempeh unless it gets, you know, it spoils and gets moldy, like anything can. And the same thing with sprouted foods. Sprouted foods should not have any mold on them, but that's why you have to rinse your sprouts. Anyone who's made sprouts before, you know, you go away for a weekend or something and you don't rinse your sprouts twice a day, you'll come back and woo, you'll smell it, and you may actually even see the mold too. So yeah, so that's why you got to rinse to keep mold and bacteria at bay. Okay, next question. How do you know if your store-bought legumes and nuts are free from high loads of mycotoxins? Can boiling destroy the mycotoxins? Can peroxide kill mycotoxins in walnuts? Is there something we should be doing? Okay, that's the problem with mycotoxins is it's hard to detect them. So now if there's a batch of visibly moldy peanuts or something, they throw out the whole batch. As I talked about, there's just huge amounts of crop losses due to this visible mold. And so they don't allow that to be sold. But there's lots of kind of invisible mold. Before it reaches that visible state, you could be making mycotoxins. And that's why this government regulation is so important, because you really, as a consumer, can't really tell. So there's nothing you do to kind of choose mold-free or not. And cooking does not. So boiling does not destroy mycotoxins, nor would peroxide. Mycotoxins are not alive. They're just a toxin. That's a very heat-stable toxin. And so is there something we should be doing about mycotoxins? Well, we should be avoiding risky foods. So if we're vacationing in Nigeria, we may not want to eat the peanut butter. And yet another reason to cut down on our pork and wine consumption. And maybe we'll find out where this aflatoxin contamination is coming from, and we can diversify our dried fruit consumption. For example, if indeed it is the figs, which we don't know yet, but I'd be eager to find out. And when we do, I'll do a video about it. Okay, if oats are cooked, do they still contain toxins? Again, it's a heat stable toxin, so you can cook them all you want, doesn't hurt the toxins. But again, the benefits of oats outweigh the risks of ochratoxin, apparently, based on the epidemiological studies, the population studies. Can you breathe in mycotoxins? Does ozone generators kill them? Again, they're not alive, so they don't really get killed. And ozone generators wouldn't affect things. But this whole breathing in mycotoxins, again, that's the toxic mold syndrome thing that shady so-called health practitioners try to scare people about in order to enrich their wallets. Are there acceptable levels of mycotoxins in urine? Don't drink your urine regardless. There's no acceptable level of urine in urine. That's it. So yeah. Yeah. Okay. Do mycotoxins accumulate in your system? To potentially very harmful levels, or do they eventually get eliminated? They do not accumulate. It's a matter of constant exposure, just like arsenic. So drinking arsenic-laden water, it's the fact that you're drinking it every day, day after day after day, or eating lots of rice day after day after day, which increase your risk for bladder cancer. But it's not something that gets stored up like in your bones, like lead does, or stored up in your fat, like some of these toxic industrial pollutants like PCBs. Okay. Next question. I'm curious about the prudence of a person with autoimmune conditions like lupus, severe allergy to aspergillus, and a sphenoid sinus infection, eating foods that may be contaminated with mold or mushrooms or fermented foods. Might the risks outweigh the potential benefits? Okay, so aspergillus, I don't know, I mean, you may be allergic to it, but aspergillus is a pathogenic fungus that can cause like sinus infections in people that are immunocompromised. Why would someone with an autoimmune condition be immunocompromised? Because you're on immunosuppressant drugs to knock down your immune system so it doesn't, attack your DNA if you have lupus. But the problem is it sets you up for immunosuppressant diseases like, infections with ubiquitous fungi like, PCP pneumonia with HIV/AIDS, or something like an aspergillus sinus infection, but it has nothing to do, but that's not a foodborne. These molds just exist in the environment and we fight them all day. Everyone with an intact immune system. It's amazing. All day long, we are fighting invaders left and right. And this really came to a head with the AIDS epidemic that started in the 80s, when all of a sudden people were dying from all these weird exotic diseases. They weren't weird and exotic. These pathogens were everywhere, but we were just battling them off day after day, kind of doing this thankless job. Little did we know, right? In fact, a lot of our energy is actually expended by our immune system every day, even when we aren't sick. We don't think we have an infection. Well, you know why we don't have an infection? Because our immune system is kicking butt every single day. But when people are immunocompromised, they can run into problems. But it's not a food mold thing; it's a environmental mold thing, which we should be. And it's not a mycotoxin thing. It's actually an invasion. You actually get live mold spores that can cause mold infections, just like you can get a bacterial infection, and that's a problem. Okay, I've seen a video on the internet. That's always a bad start. Now, coming from someone who does videos on the internet, but again, that's why I cite my sources. I show you the sources. I give links to all my sources. Anyway, I've seen a video on the internet which says that PSA, prostate-specific antigen, is nothing but a test for mold. There's a whole list of foods to avoid that may contain mycotoxins. You know anything about this to avoid foods that contain mycotoxins to prevent or reduce prostate cancer, or about PSA tests being tested for mold. That's absolutely not true. Crazy. I have no idea. That is, yeah, no, prostate specific antigen is a test for a prostate specific molecule. And so if you have a lot more than your prostate amount of prostate tissue would suggest, you may have prostate cancer. There is no recommendation for men to get PSA testing from USPSTF, the United States Preventive Services Task Force. I've been asked many a time by many a doctor whether I want a PSA test, and I say no. Why do I say no? Because the data just isn't there, and they shouldn't even be offering it as far as I'm concerned, until we have data that shows it actually helps. Okay, anyway, that's a little side tangent. What toxins in food cause platelets to fall or drop? And what can you do to keep the count up? Okay, there's a little, well, I guess it's kind of toxins in food. Platelets falling. It's not the foods that you eat that cause your platelets to fall. Typically, it's actually an autoimmune condition where your body eats up your own platelets. Something called ITP. And so it's a matter of treating the cause. That is not, as far as I'm concerned, a diet-related condition. I have not looked to see if there's any dietary interventions that have been shown to help, but nothing I've kind of run across just kind of randomly. Can you get mycotoxins from raw mushrooms? The toxins in mushrooms are actually not mycotoxins. Well, I guess you call it a mycotoxin? I mean, it is a fungus, and it is, so there's this compound called ligaritine that's not good for us. I guess you'd call it a mycotoxin, but that mycotoxin is actually sensitive to heat, and so you can microwave. Wait, I just did a video about this. Microwave what, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and get a remarkable drop in ligaritine levels. So I encourage people to cook their mushrooms, and that can be as simple as a little microwaving. I use Dr. Sinclair products. I'm not sure what Sinclair you're talking about. Do they help fix mycotoxin levels? I have no idea. There's a famous Dr. Sinclair from Harvard in the longevity space. I don't think he sells products. I would hope not, but so I don't know what you're talking about. Is Candida considered mycotoxins? What are your thoughts on Candida? Fantastic question. So Candida is a yeast, and there is this similar, and so there's this purported Candida syndrome has been used to describe a whole variety of vague complaints. Again, this is from shady so-called health practitioners that have concocted this syndrome to sell supplements and buy themselves BMWs. I have a video about it talking about, so basically normal people have Candida in their gut. Everybody has a little Candida in their gut. And so, they test for it and they say, oh my God, you have Candida in your gut, take all these supplements or don't eat sugar or all these other things. Not eating sugar is a good idea anyway. It has nothing to do with Candida. They've actually randomized people to high sugar, low sugar diets, on. And I go through all the data, and just does not seem to exist. And so just type in Candida in NutritionFacts.org, and that will pop right up. Okay. How does climate change increase the risk of mycotoxins? How does it? So it's this hot, humid weather that can increase mold growth in areas that normally would not be hot and humid. Does the off-the-shelf nutritional yeast contain mycotoxins? No. That's very nice. So the yeast that's in nutritional yeast is the same yeast that's in bakers and brewers yeast. And those yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, I don't know how to pronounce it. I just seen it written, or cerevisiae, does not produce any toxins, which is nice. So we don't have to worry about beer mycotoxins, or bread mycotoxins, or nutritional yeast mycotoxins. unless, of course, you have spoiled bread, etc. Okay, moldy bread. Okay, how do these toxins form? What if you grow your own food? The toxins form because the mold actually makes them. And if you grow your own food, well, grow your food, presumably you'll have fresher food. So the food that you buy in a grocery store may have been sitting on on a ship for a week from New Zealand or something, and so it's already like a week old. Whereas farmers market or community supported agriculture or your own garden, the mold process, the decay process for fresh fruits and vegetables will obviously start much later because you got it right off the bush. Is this toxicity the same toxicity from black mold? Black mold. Yeah. So the black mold is the toxic mold syndrome thing. And so, really not much of a thing. I know there's lots of, there's a big industry about remediation and testing for black mold, and but it has not been demonstrated. Seeing a little spot of that particular type of mold has not actually been correlated with any health effects. Do these toxins build up in animals through their diet? Well, they don't build up, but if they're eating moldy grain, then they have mycotoxins in them when they're slaughtered, and then so that's presumably how the pork becomes contaminated. Can we wash steel cut oats to reduce mycotoxins? Would oat milk be high in mycotoxins? Does freezing oats before storage have any effect? Nothing we can do. There's really nothing we can do once we have it in our house that's going to affect it, whether washing or freezing or processing or cooking. Yeah. So if the oats are moldy and they're mycotoxins, then your oat milk that you make with those oats would be similarly. Although that's a good question. What about conventional, commercial oat milk? I have not seen that tested, but that would seem to be the logical next step. Presumably when these studies were done, there was no such thing as oat milk, right? It's a relatively new phenomenon, what, a year or two? But there should be totally studies on oat milk to see what the ochratoxin levels are. Fascinating. It's a good question. And indeed, if they found them, then I would indeed encourage people, which I already do, switch from oat milk, which is not very nutritious. It's basically just oat water and oil, and switch over to something like soy milk, which actually has some nutrition. Okay, I eat steel cut oats every day for breakfast. Should I vary my grains? Steel cut oats, super healthy. You should continue to eat steel cut oats. What I do is I do my groat mixture on my bro bowl. And so, but it certainly has oats in there. I actually use oat groats, which are uncut steel cut oats, kind of one step less processed. But I eat my oats every day as part of my mix, but I vary it just because there are things in rye and barley and sorghum and these other wonderful grains that are not necessarily found in oats. And so it's just a greater diversity. But eating your oats is better than not eating your oats. Mycotoxins be damned. How about activated grains, nuts, and seeds, and more heavily or more often contaminated? I assume by activated, you mean soaked. I don't encourage people to soak their nuts, grains, and seeds because it leaches out the phytates, which are actually seem to be beneficial in humans. Okay, can I share some sources on toxic mold syndrome? I've read sources that describe a genetic link to inability to clear mycotoxins, and therefore people with these genes tend to have more symptoms from toxic mold exposure. Is that really all a myth? Again, references we appreciated to discuss the signs. So yeah, I'd be happy to, we can include, the videos go up on the site. Obviously I include all those links, but I guess when we do a webinar, you don't really get those links. You just kind of get the videos. Well, you can actually see, so when I talk in the toxic mold section and how there's really no good scientific evidence to support the whole toxic mold syndrome thing, genetics be damned. You actually see what the paper it is and you can look it up. but it's not as easy as just kind of clicking a hyperlink and pulling down the PDF. Yeah, we can include that. Because yeah, it's such a kind of a seemingly controversial area. It's not scientifically controversial, but just because there's the whole industry that's been made based on this lie. Yeah, so we will include all the toxic mold syndrome sources when we send out the recording. So we'll send links to all those, so you can read them now and don't have to wait till the videos come up. Back to something maybe we should do in general with webinars, but here certainly particularly. Okay. Where are we? Okay, what spices should we avoid for aflatoxin? Aflatoxin, I remember seeing much stuff on on spices with aflatoxin. Certainly with ochratoxin, you see high levels. We use so little of it that it really has a very small dietary contribution. And so I think the only thing I'd be concerned about would be this milk thistle. These dietary supplements, milk thistle, which just seem to be so routinely contaminated that I would recommend against them. Did I come across any information on coffee as a source of mycotoxins, especially with the majority of coffee beans are grown internationally? Regulations may differ from ours in the United States. See, it's ironic. We think, well, yeah, it won't be as good as U.S. regulations. But remember, for the ochratoxin, we were the one country that didn't have regulations. So it would actually be better if it was from a country that actually looked at this stuff and said, wait a second, like Brazil said, look, you can't have more than 2, which is better than China, etc. Anyway, yeah, no, coffee was not a significant source of mycotoxins for whatever reason. I don't know if coffee beans just don't get moldy or they're just not moldy with the right stuff. Blood levels of mycotoxins do not reveal body load of our gut, fat, or brain tissues, so I use this as a standard. I would challenge you to present me with evidence of that fact. That certainly was not what I saw in the literature, but I'm always open to learning. I have stratospheric urinary levels of ochratoxin A. I have oatmeal daily. Is there something I can do to bring down my high ochratoxin levels while not sacrificing nutrition? You can find a different oatmeal. So if you really do have high ochratoxin levels, and whatever oatmeal you're getting is contaminated, so switch to a different oatmeal. Or you can certainly switch to another grain. It's possible that, and it'd be interesting if you continue eating the same oatmeal and got retested, whether you still have high levels. Maybe it was just a bad batch. Okay, next question. What food should we minimize to decrease toxin exposure? Again, it's the risk versus benefit kind of thing. And so if although nuts, for example, can be contaminated with aflatoxin, the benefits of nuts outweigh the risks as per the population studies. And so I can continue to eat nuts. And so the only foods I would recommend decreasing are foods that aren't good anyway. And it's kind of like the acrylamide story. Remember the acrylamide story where there was this purported carcinogen in crispy carbs. French fries, potato chips at the highest levels. So did like rye crackers or something, which would be something that'd be much healthier. And so basically, if you remember, God, this was like 10 years ago, when we really didn't know how bad this stuff was. It was basically like, okay, well, look, this is just use this as another reason not to eat potato chips and French fries, which aren't good for you either. But I would not yet, until we actually had human data, because this was all laboratory animal data, until we had human data, I wouldn't cut out really healthy foods that may be contaminated. And then it turns out when they actually did human studies, acrylamide does not appear to be an issue. So, okay. Still not good to eat French fries, potato chips, but we no longer have that additional reason. So same thing, use this as an additional reason to cut down on wine and pork consumption. But perhaps with the exception of dried figs, the foods that have been implicated it seems that consumers of those foods have lower rates of disease than those who don't. So the benefits outweigh the risks. We don't know yet about dried figs, but if we do find out that dry fig consumers are more likely to have for their blood to test positive for aflatoxin, I would then indeed say, okay, let's move from dried figs to dried apricots or some other. Let us diversify our dried fruits. And we just don't have that data yet, but that certainly could be coming once we have dietary survey data. Does U.S. test their corn supply for aflatoxins? Oh boy, do they, and they lose massive amounts of crops to moldy corn. Is there data on farmed or wild-caught fish? Huge amounts of data on farmed wild-caught fish, but not as far as I know in terms of mycotoxins. Although, there certainly are some fish that are fed grains, which could potentially be moldy, but that's not something I looked at. But in terms of other toxins, other pollutants, farm fish, much higher levels in general than wild-caught fish. Okay. If I have high levels of ochratoxin in my system, how or what method would you use to detox? Well, you just stop being exposed. Again, it's the kind of thing that just flows through your system. And so you just stop it from flowing through your system. It's like you don't really detox from something like arsenic. You just don't get exposed to more arsenic. Similarly with like mercury, right? They do these studies where they give people tuna, and then they stop tuna, and you see the half-life. It was like 90 days or something. In 90 days, your blood levels fall in half once you stop the fish, and then 90 days drop in half again. And so by 270 days or something, you've wiped out about 99% of the mercury that was building up in your system. So it's not being exposed. So if you were to have high levels, then maybe there's something in your diet that is particularly contaminated, and so you could switch brands or get retested and see where that is. Again, we don't know if it's a human carcinogen, but if you have a source of exposure and you can just switch over to another source, why not do it? Do tea leaves have mycotoxins? I did not find neither tea nor coffee problems with mycotoxins in my research. How would I know if I've been affected by mycotoxins, or their known side effects or their known effects? So the effects of mycotoxins we're concerned about are cancer. So it's the kind of thing where you really wouldn't know. It's just potentially increasing your cancer risk, or definitely increasing your cancer risk when it comes to aflatoxin. It's not something that is like, oh, I don't feel good. That's not the mycotoxins we're talking about. Okay, the National Toxicology Program has labeled ochratoxin as a reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen, but not red meat. Your thoughts? I know outcome studies show lower cancer rates in which those who eat grains, but why dismiss the carcinogenicity of ochratoxin A? No, so red meat is a probable human carcinogen according to the IARC, and as opposed to processed meat, which is a known human carcinogen, category 1 carcinogen. And so ochratoxin would be more in that second category, this kind of probable based on laboratory animal studies. I'm not dismissing the carcinogenicity of ochratoxin A, showing that whole grains could be even more protective against cancer if they didn't have ochratoxin, but they're still overall protective against cancer. And so that's why we should continue to eat them. And we are down to our last minute. So I just want to tell everyone, clear your calendar for September 17th. The next webinar, if you're interested, will be on white potatoes. September 17th, you can subscribe for free to our newsletter, NutritionFacts.org, to make sure you are in the loop. I hope you learned a ton today. I know I certainly did, and just so wanted to share this information with you. So hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thanks for joining me. Stay safe, be kind, get vaccinated, and eat your veggies.